Hello, and welcome to Freelance Frontiers, a weekly conversation navigating the future of flexible work. I'm Ray Hames. I'm an agency expat, brand side leader, and former freelancer myself. And I'm here with Nick Hammond. Hey, Nick.
How's it going?
Who is a career freelance creative turned coach. We are here to chat about both sides of the freelance relationship, and we hope that our listeners will find something in here that helps them smooth out the bumps along the road of working with and as freelancers.
And as always, if you have feedback, insights, questions, or would like to join us on a future episode, just drop us a DM. In our last episode, we talked about trust, both on the freelancer and client ends of the spectrum. And today we're going to be talking about something really important for creative and engineering freelancers, which is intellectual property.
Yeah, and I think to give listeners a high level overview to anchor the conversation. Typically, if you're an employee of a company, everything you create at that job belongs to that company. So if you invent new tools or write new code, or you develop a product concept, or even a logo that ends up getting trademarked on behalf of the company owns the rights to whatever you created. That's considered intellectual property. But if you're a freelancer, you technically have the right to establish ownership over any asset you create on behalf of your clients. But the actual reality of the situation is that clients are hiring you to create these valuable assets on their behalf. That's why they're paying you. And they'll almost always insist on contract clauses that are usually referred to as a work for hire clause that specifies that they retain ownership of whatever they pay you to create for them. So hopefully that helps kind of anchor the conversation of what intellectual property means when you're an employee or a freelancer. Nick, what scenarios have you seen as a freelancer that you'd want to consider modifying or pushing back on that standard work for hire clause?
Yeah, so on my end, I think usually what I've seen is more related to prototypes or earlier versions or drafts of things. Specifically on the freelancers end, it's because a lot of these types of things end up being used for things like portfolio case studies and things of the like. And so if I don't have some sort of ability to use those in different use cases after the fact, I'm kind of crippling my ability to then, piggyback off of some of that work in the future.
Yeah, and there's probably two things at play there. One is claiming ownership of a product that then has tangible value. If you develop an app for a company that then gets sold in the app store and a company's making money off of it, but you did the work as a contractor and you signed a work for hire clause, you're not going to see any of that revenue. But the use case that you're talking about is a very reasonable one. You just want to be able to talk about that, to say, hey, I built that. Hey, I designed that. And that's, having the right to showcase your work in a portfolio.
Yep.
Is that a fair assessment of those kind of two scenarios?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. And it's interesting because certainly there's some big companies, Apple has a massive contractor workforce, and it is top secret what they do there and what you produce as a contractor for that company. You'll almost never come across a portfolio that shows Apple work because of that. And yet, to be able to say, hey, I designed the slick feature would be incredibly valuable on most, say UX designers' portfolios. What has been your experience negotiating for the second piece of that, just the right to show work that you were involved with?
Yeah, I think like I had mentioned a little bit ago, I think most of this kind of revolves around the concepting phase and being able to use that sort of work that I've done in order to inform thinking of other projects. So specifically, I think the best use case that comes to mind is something like a logo design project. And so typically what I would do is try and negotiate an ability to retain the IP to a lot of the initial concepts that aren't used, because a lot of that work not just being used for something like a portfolio, but being used in a different situation where, let's say, another client comes forward and has maybe not necessarily the same type of project that they need a solution for, but there's some overlap in the thinking. And if I can retain the rights to those initial concepts, I can reuse those as a starting point for other projects that kind of help get that off the ground a little more quickly. And if I don't have that, I'm starting from base level on a lot of it. The other side of that too being that, if a client has retained all of the intellectual property to all of that work, they can then take some of those concepts and move forward with them outside of using you as the contractor to keep them moving. And that can usually kind of be like a little stab in the heart if you're like, man,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
started that and I didn't get to finish it or work through it to the next degree.
I've seen that same thing on the agency side with campaign concepts, where, you know, we as an agency team have come up with ideas to market a product, you know, and we've had that in our contract where we own the rights to the unused concept and the client is only retaining rights to the finished product. That's exactly the same use case where, you know, there's totally times where with a couple tweaks, you know, especially in the early concepting phase, a couple tweaks, a good idea is a good idea, whether you're talking about, you know, tortillas or hot dog buns. And you can get a lot of legs that way. And it also makes sense, you know, from I can see what you're saying from a design perspective. Same thing. I've been burned on concepting where we've provided concepts in early rounds to the point that, you know, a client has taken those concepts and had somebody else produce them for cheaper than what we quoted.
Yep.
And that is, that's a reality. It's a bummer reality. You know,
and I don't I don't necessarily think that they always are, you know, trying to go out of their way to do that either. I think a lot of times it's this like we don't know where we're going, and so they put it down, and then a few months later they go a different route, realize that's a dead end, and then they go, actually, let's go back over here, and they kind of pick it up again. And they're, you know, maybe there's new team members that weren't privy to who was working on it before or something, and it can get a little squirrely.
That's a very positive interpretation of those situations.
That's what I like to think, at least.
Yeah. And like, let's talk about another piece here, which I think is something that increasingly freelancers are using to supplement their income streams, which is creating sellable IP. So what we talked about in the before, you know, the first couple questions that we were chatting about, it was all about creating work for hire on behalf of a company. But if you're creating just to create, you are creating for yourself, and that becomes, you know, a sellable asset. Tell me a little bit about, from your perspective, you know, kind of how that looks.
Yeah, so I'm actually kind of in the process of doing a little bit of this myself, but from the design side of things, I think a lot of things that end up being more of like a sellable IP from a creative perspective are things like stock deck designs that you can set up as templates, fonts, graphic or texture packs, icons, and, you know, anything like courses where you're trying to teach someone how to do something. All of those can be considered intellectual property. And if you create them for yourself and not on behalf of a client, you own and have the rights to sell those to others. So that's kind of like how I tend to think of those sort of things, at least from the creative perspective.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, you know, are you seeing a market for that type of IP asset? Like, I know there's Etsy designers, for example, that will design decks or design hard, you know, things like party invites or whatever, but like digital templates. Digital template design is a real easy win for, I think, a capable graphic designer. But, you know, when you're selling these other, like, where are people selling them through?
Yeah, I mean, to back up to the first question, there's a huge market for this sort of thing. I think the difficulty is that as especially in the creative fields, you kind of get pinned between this like AI impending thing coming from one direction and a lot of these layoffs and, you know, tech things happening on the other side. You're kind of caught in the middle of like, how do I supplement my income? And this is where a lot of people turn now. And so I think the industry itself is becoming more saturated than it ever has been. And so it becomes more about your reach and branding and your ability to actually sell those products and find products that people want. But I think the biggest examples that I've seen are like, one that blew up that I didn't even know existed until a few months ago was templates for resumes on Etsy. That's hugely popular. Because I think a lot of the reason is because, you know, someone outside of a creative industry that maybe can't get into a tool and design that quickly, for someone like that, you pay $10. It's super cheap. You download it and you can edit to your heart's content. So those are super easy. And then, yeah, in the creative world, it's just quick asset stuff that can help you go from 0 to 1 on a concept more quickly, whether that's, UI elements for like a web kind of thing, or like textures if you're trying to do apparel stuff. Like, it's kind of the whole 9 yards. Um, the font thing is getting super popular now too, for more people. And then also, I think as the kind of like creator economy type of thing gets going, um, more and more of this is turning to website templates for other places like Squarespace or
That makes sense.
WordPress and things like that, because that side of things is kind of like fracturing into a million pieces too. Like before, if you wanted to create a portfolio, let's say, you had to go to only one of a few places to do it. And now there's so many of these kind of like WYSIWYG style editors that you have a million different options of, one, the platform, but two, what kind of template you use just to get a base level of a website up.
Yeah, definitely. And if some of that heavy lifting can be done for you in terms of page organization and site hierarchy, then that's just one less piece of the puzzle that somebody like me would need to learn.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, it's crazy too, because it seems like there's so much of that out in existence now that you almost kind of get this decision fatigue where you're like, there's so much here now, I don't even know where to start. So I'm just going to like buy none of it.
Yeah, that's true. And it'll be interesting to see, we talked about Etsy as a platform to find some of these digital, assets. It's a digital asset marketplace. There's specific niche ones that I know for fonts, for example. But I think that it's such a, it is just very distributed. There's not like one central marketplace for pre-created assets. I'll be interested to see how that goes. There's an idea.
Yeah,
Someone wants
absolutely.
to take it.
I think there's some places too, like a creative marketplace. Like I
Yeah.
know, I think it was Dribble. There's a few other like designer hubs where you can showcase work, and you kind of see this like behind the scenes thing where like an umbrella company will start to come in and buy out these other little things to kind of like merge all of it together. So there's definitely this kind of conglomerate thing happening where they're trying to merge in marketplaces to make it easier for you to find all of that in one place. But yeah, the other way is just following people that you think are cool on social media. A lot of people end up, being able to sell their own things just through their own site that way.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you one more question that's a little off script.
Yes.
But I'm curious if you've seen anything. Let's take logo design for an example.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see or predict that as creators release more of this kind of sellable IP to supplement their more focused client work, do you think that it helps clients find people that they want to work with for, let's say, custom projects? Or do you think that it devalues custom work because you're really just modifying kind of templates that somebody has already created?
Yes, that is a fantastic question. And I think the answer is like, it has yet to be seen. And I think that's because we've only started to see the onset of a lot of this stuff at a scale where it could potentially affect other things. I think a great explanation to point to, or example to point to here, is kind of the use of like Canva, where I've heard stories of, early career designers kind of becoming interested in design through Canva, which is awesome. But then I also think there's the other side of it, which is, if a company sees Canva as a long-term solution to a design problem, you're not necessarily getting the level that you need out of it. And I think the use case is still there for people that need to do things quickly and not have to pay a ton for it. But I think where it gets dangerous is when you start to blur the line between thinking that that is going to be a long-term solution and kind of knowing where it fits and when to get out of that realm of use case.
I think that that's a fair call out, where it really just depends on the degree of sophistication that either a freelancer has or a company needs, and making sure that those both needs and skills are aligned.
Yes. And I think too, the way that I always look at all of this with AI and sort of this question as well, is like, all of these things come in trends. And what usually happens for people that are doing creative work is a new tool or something will come out that tends to kind of pull certain work out of your realm. But what happens, you know, and what I think will happen with things like Canva is it gets rid of a lot of this like kind of just pixel pushing, kind of like super quick, change this font, spit it out, move on kind of thing. And it takes that away from a designer. So what happens is in the interim, you have that happen, but then in a few years, a lot of the places using that are going to start to realize that they're outgrowing the need for that platform or that app. And then they come back in and say, okay, who do we find to actually take this to the next level? So I think a lot of it from a design perspective is just having enough skin in the game to wait out that period for those people who have started using it and then outgrow it and say, okay, now what do I do now that this thing isn't solving our problem anymore?
Yeah. Yeah. Really interesting. And makes sense as both kind of sides evolve.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, I think that's our time for today chatting about IP. Great chat as usual.
Yes, as well.
If you found this useful or not, really, either way, follow us here and over on LinkedIn for more tips on how you can get the most of working with and as freelancers today. Thank you. Thanks, Nick.
Bye.